morning, Mr. Mkwena. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chair.
We are starting about 5 minutes late, and I think yesterday too, we were starting a few minutes later than we should have started. And for all of that, I am responsible. We are going to try and do better. Thank you. Are you ready to proceed?
We are ready, Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Mahomedy, before we move on to the new topic, yesterday I was reflecting on your evidence in relation to the acquisition of the locomotives. And I think one of the aspects that we did not touch on is the question of the pricing. Can you give us a sense as to, from the time when Transnet engaged CSR up until the time when we are now referring to in terms of the locomotives, what was the price difference?
Good morning, Chair.
Good morning, Mr. Mahomedy.
Transnet had acquired previously locomotives from various entities.
Yes.
And as we provided testimony to the 95 locomotives that were provided, or the agreement was signed somewhere in 2012, that was at a price of 28.2 million rand a locomotive. The 100 locomotives, which was in 2014, we paid 44 million rand for those locomotives.
In 2 years?
Within 2 years. And in 2014, we also at the time then signed the contract for the 359, which is part of the 1064. And that price is just over 50 million rand a locomotive. So in a 2-year period, one sees the price of a similar locomotive. Yes, there are specification differences between the locomotive, but the price has moved from 28 million to 50 million rand, or just over 50 million rand a locomotive.
Yes. Right.
That's the, that was the electric locomotive with China South Rail.
Yes. Now, may I then refer you to page 19 of your statement. And we are just about to address a new topic on paragraph 5.6, which you have termed as the interest rate swaps, which were prejudicial to Transnet. But before doing that, there are 3, if not 4 issues which I need to converse with you so that we can be able to properly place your evidence in context. The first one, if you can explain to us what are these interest swaps, all right? And the second one is that when one considering these interest swaps, what are the factors that you might need to consider before you execute such an interest swap? And thirdly, if you can educate us about the distinction between the floating interest rate and the fixed interest rate. And then lastly, if you're able to do so, also share with us the advantages and the disadvantages of those 2 types of interest. Obviously, you will link them to the transactions that you are going to be adducing evidence upon. Let's take them now in 10 before we deal with the specifics. The interest swaps, what does that mean? What are those?
I think, Chair, the first thing is that we just need to recap that Transnet went into a number of loan transactions, as we explained yesterday. We had the KfW Development Bank loan out of Germany for 2.76 billion rand. and the EDC, the Canada Exim, together with Investec for 6.991 billion rand.
Yes.
Those two had direct relationships with the delivery of the Bombardier locomotives. We then had the United States Exim Bank, together with South African institutions for 5.7 billion rand, which was directly associated with the General Electric locomotive contract. We had the ZA Club loan, which we spoke about, 12 billion rand. And then we had the China Development Bank facility, which was for $1.5 billion, which was largely for the China South Rail and China North Rail locomotives. The reason that's important is because as we go further in the discussions, all of those particular loan transactions were what we call floating rates, but we will again discuss that. I think we also need to take a step back. Transnet as a business would require funding on a time basis, depending on the activities, the capital expansion, etc. Traditionally, we could either fund our business through the cash that we generate from within the business in its operations.
Yes.
Or we would have to borrow money. And that is done through financial institutions, both locally and globally. When one has to engage with financial institutions, there are a few factors that you have to look at. And it is no different to an individual borrowing money for whether it's a home or a car, where you look at, first and foremost, you look at what is the interest rate, whether that's affordable to you, so the company in this case, what's the repayment terms, what's the maturity period, any other fees that the lender is actually considering or will include, and what are the collateral and guarantees that the lender will be requiring. Now, when we look at all of that, you will look at it, you will then decide and assess whether this is a loan that you want to engage in. One additional thing from an institution perspective like Transnet, we will ask whether the rate is floating or fixed.
Yes.
A floating rate is simply a variable rate, meaning that it has a link to an index. Traditionally, in institutions like Transnet, it would have a link to what is called JIBA, the Johannesburg Interbank Rate.
Yes.
In an individual's case, it will be prime, and it's either prime plus or prime minus. It's a similar example. So when we look at the floating rate, as I said, it would be linked to JIBA. It would say JIBA plus a number of basis points or X percentage. And if JIBA increases, then your interest will increase. If JIBA decreases, then you should see a decrease in your interest rate. When we talk about a fixed rate, it is essentially looking at the term of the agreement and then applying a rate of interest that is not changeable over the period of this loan or the period of the agreement. Now, there's a few factors around a fixed rate. The first is that if it's a long-term loan that you've taken, the fixed rate would ordinarily be higher than your floating rate because the bank or the financial institution that's lending you money on a fixed rate will have to factor in the risk of whether the rate is going to move, in which direction that rate is going to move. And the longer the term, the greater the risk to the bank, because this is now based on a number of variables that could affect the interest rate. In this case, in all of the loans that we outlined earlier on, Transnet engaged with the lenders on a floating rate basis, meaning these had all been linked to some index, either JIBOR, which is Johannesburg, or LIBOR, which is the London interbank rate.
And floating in this context, floating interest rate means the same as like fluctuating interest rate?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it would be linked to what happens to interest rates over a period of time.
Yes.
Chair, what is also important is that these were loan agreements that were over a period of time, some of them going to up to 15 years. So they are long-term loans that are applicable to Transnet. That's the basis of the transaction.
Yes.
So what is a swap? It is essentially where we enter into an arrangement with a financial institution, and we then convert the floating rate to a swap, to a fixed rate. Now, it's done in a different way, in the sense that it does not affect the underlying loan transaction. That loan transaction remains for Transnet's account, but with the institution, or what we then call the counterparty, we will then engage in a transaction which is a derivative instrument, where the financial institution will essentially buy the floating rate and sell us a fixed rate. I hope I'm explaining that clearly. And using an example, if we had a 100,000 rand loan, which was at 9%, on an annual basis, that would mean that you were to pay 9,000 rand interest. That's a floating rate. And next year, if the rate goes to 10, then it's 10,000 rand. The financial institution would essentially say, okay, we'll take the 9,000 rand risk, but we'll now charge you 12% fixed. So you got no variability on the rate, but you will now have a higher interest rate, which means Transnet must pay the financial institution 12,000, the financial institution pays us 9,000. At the end of the day, it increases your interest bill by the 3,000. Now, it gets a little more complex when it comes to transactions the sizes of that we are talking about, which is multi-billion rand. It goes into the cash flows, etc. But essentially, Chair, that's what it is. It's a swap between the two rates, de-risking for Transnet, or a perception of de-risking for Transnet, to say, well, you now have a fixed rate for 12 years, 15 years in this case.
Of course, just as in the case of an individual having a loan with a financial institution, the advantage of a fixed interest rate is that both parties have certainty as to what they are in for, and that the financial institution is kind of protected in case the interest rates go down, but also the individual is kind of protected in case the interest rates go up. So they agree, everyone is certain, they can plan, the individual can plan his or her financial, make her financial plans, knowing what exactly his or her obligations would be. If it's a fluctuating interest rate, when the interest rates go down, as a borrower, you are very happy. When they go up, you are not happy. The same considerations apply to an entity such as Transnet when it enters into these transactions.
Yes, Chair. Those are exactly some of the considerations.
Yes.
But one, from a company perspective, one has to look at the term of the loan as well, and what the economists are saying in terms of whether that interest rate will actually increase over a period of time. Because if you fix it, you have to look at what rate you're fixing it at and whether that is making business sense. And the reason that you are mandated to look at that from a fiduciary perspective is to ensure that you don't bring undue costs even though you correctly point out, Chair, it removes the uncertainty and gives you a fixed price number, the challenge is that if a rate that's quoted to you at a point in time, interest rate, if that is deemed too high in the long term, then it costs you a lot more money. And I think when we apply it to billions, it translates into billions of rands that can be lost. So it is a calculated risk that a business should take. And there's significant amount of calculations that have to go into determining whether that risk, or whether the company has the appetite for that risk.
Yes.
So you just, whether it's a company or an individual, they must just do their homework
Yes,
before
Chair.
agreeing to
Yes,
a
Chair.
fixed interest rate or a fluctuating interest rate or floating interest rate.
That's true, Chair.
Yeah.
Yes.
Realistically speaking, to answer a question in terms of some of the advantages or possible advantages, the loan really becomes advantageous to an institution when the interest rates begin to increase.
Yeah.
And if the interest rates stay very flat and you've taken a rate out at a much higher price, then again, as the Chair pointed out, you will be sitting there with a loss position because you could have taken a loan at a much lower interest rate. And I think there's also a number of other considerations. One of the key things is actually to understand the term, as I said, what is the forward view from the experts in the field in terms of what will happen to the interest rate. That requires a number of, it's got a number of variables, whether we talk about the inflation in the country or we talk about key positions that are held, the elections, all of these things, the political stance that people take and analysis that's done, all of that has an impact on the potential of what could happen to an interest rate, whether it would be impacted positively or negatively.
Yes. Now, against that background and clarity that you have now furnished to us, may we then proceed to interrogate the relevant facts pertinent to this topic, starting from paragraph 5.6.1. Take us through.
Chair, as I mentioned earlier on, all of the loans that we had undertaken as Transnet were executed on what is called the floating rate, which essentially means they were linked to an index. These were executed at a point in time. The club loan, by the way, for which we paid trillion, the 93.5 million rand, was between a number of parties, ABSA, Nedbank, Omsfin, Future Growth, and the Bank of China, totaling 12 billion rand, had two drawdowns, meaning that the 12 billion was not made available to Transnet in one check. It was lent to Transnet in two tranches. The first tranche was on the 1st of December 2015.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Maybe I should have asked this yesterday. Why is it called a club loan? Are there multi-parties to it?
Yes, Chair. It's simply a syndicated loan with more than one party, and therefore it was given this term.
So different financial institutions who are prepared to lend you money on maybe different terms. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah, but the agreement is the same.
The agreement is the same, but it's held individually with those entities.
Yes,
It
yes.
doesn't necessarily mean that the terms and conditions are exactly the same.
Yes.
They would be similar.
Yes.
We would have gone out to the market and said, we are looking for 12 billion rand and our term
Yeah.
is 15 years.
Yeah.
You need to present a proposal that will be assessed.
Yeah.
So the
okay.
ZAR Club loan was essentially a syndication of five institutions in this case, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you may then proceed. We are saying you're still on paragraph 5.6.2.
Yes. So on the 1st of December 2015, of the 12 billion club loan, there was a requirement that 4.5 billion be lent to Transnet on the 1st of December. The balance of 7.5 billion was to have been provided later on. On the 3rd of December, Chair, the former head of Treasury, Mr. Ramasubudi, submits a memorandum to Mr. Peter, the then Group Chief Financial Officer, recommending that the interest rate on the club loan be converted from floating to fixed.
Now, before you proceed further with that, may I refer you to folder number 23, Chair, that is on page 454. It's being marked as MSM 23. And before you deal with your evidence any further, just as a high level, a high level interrogation of that document, please, to take us through it and the essence and why was it important in relation to the evidence that we are choosing now.
Chair, I think page 454 gives a perspective of the involvement of certain entities.
I'm sorry, I was at 517, so.
No, 454. Chair.
454.
Yes.
Okay.
That is folder
But
number
did you
23.
say anything, Mr. Mkwana, about 33 item?
No.
Oh, I went to
23.
divide that 33.
23.
Oh, okay, all right. 454 is where
Yes.
I should be. Okay, let me just get there. Okay, I'm there. Thank you.
Chair, it's the document that's titled 1064 Timelines.
Yes.
We have endeavored to put together the entire perspective on the 1064 transaction. And the reason that it becomes quite important is for one to understand the role of certain entities in the entire process. When we consider the procurement of 1064, it tends to get a very focused attention around the procurement principles and around the potential issues around 38 to 54 billion rand. And it is generally limited to that conversation. However, one has to look at the entire 1064 process, commencing from July 2012, when the RFP was issued, at which time the business case was not approved. It was approved subsequent to that, but the RFP was issued subject to the approval.
Yes.
We then have the Locomotive advisory contract, which we spoke about, which initially was with the McKinsey consortium and then purported to have been ceded to Regiments. That fee structure, as we explained yesterday, Chair, moved significantly from 35.2 million rand. And the beneficiary of that was largely Regiments.
Yes.
To the tune of, I think, about 267 million rand. Chair, it didn't stop there. It then went further into the funding. And the CDB loan of $1.5 billion, for which Regiments were paid 166 million success fee. Then we moved to the ZAR Club loan, for which Trillion were paid 93.5 million, which is including VAT. So it was 82 million plus VAT. And then we move into this conversation of the interest rate swaps. The interest rate swaps are for a total of the loan implications of that, or the loans that were essentially swapped from floating to fixed, totaled just over 23.3 billion rand. And regiments, as far as we have been able to ascertain, were paid by the Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund, an amount just over 227 million rand for the execution of these swaps. We will explain all of this as we go through.
Just for the swaps?
Correct, Chair. There were two swaps, and one swap was directly between Transnet and the TSDBF, the pension fund, and the other one was done with Nedbank as the counterparty. Nedbank have confirmed subsequently that they have not paid any fees directly to Regiments.
I'm a layperson to these financial things, but you have explained to me that an interest rate swap is basically converting from either a fixed rate to a floating rate, or from a floating rate to a fixed rate. That seems to suggest to me that there is not a lot of work that needs to be done. Obviously, there may be a lot of homework to be done by somebody who must recommend whether a swap should happen or not, and then the person who must decide. But I'm just not sure. Is there a lot of work involved to justify such a high amount of fee, generally speaking?
Chair, before we ask the question about the amount of work, I think it's key to know that the Transnet Treasury team had the capability to do this work.
Yes, yes, yes.
The other thing that is also key is that the 227 million that was paid is what we call a present value of all the fees that would have accrued to regiments over a 15-year period. It is a lot more in what we would call nominal terms, but it was paid out of the pension fund on day one. So the pension fund lost 227 million, but essentially it was all relating to this transaction with Transnet. So in the one case, Chair, as we understand, with Nedbank would have done the work in terms of the pricing, in terms of all of the analysis, and then provided Transnet with the calculation of the interest rate. However, that was done through Regiments, an intermediary that we believe was not necessary, because the capability existed within Transnet to do this. Yes, the 227 million rand is quite significant, Chair. Actually, from the documents that we've reviewed through the pension fund, it was worked out on both the swaps, the Nedbank swaps, what we call the Nedbank swaps, as well as the pension fund swaps, where we had done a direct transaction. So they essentially were, I'm not saying two specific swaps, but two groups of swaps. The first was a 12 billion rand loan, the ZA Club loan, which was at a floating rate, which was then swapped to a fixed rate, and that was executed by Nedbank in conjunction with Regiments. We have also learned that Nedbank then essentially sold that swap forward to the pension fund. So ultimately, from a Transnet perspective, we have got a complicated transaction between Transnet, Nedbank, and the pension fund. Then there was a second grouping of swaps, Chair, which was an amount of about 11.3 billion rand, the loans totaling 11.3 billion, which was swapped directly with the pension fund. Both, if you would like to call it the calculation of the commission for regiments, I would use the word commission just to explain the concept, was calculated at 20 basis points, which is 0.2% of all of the cash flows over the 15-year period, and then present valued to today's money at the time, which was calculated at 227.8 million, I think it was, which was paid out to regiments from the pension fund. It was not paid out by Transnet, but it was paid out from the pension fund. The pension fund is currently in a process of litigation with regiments for those funds.
But their fee, that is now regiments, would have been this. How much it was would have been in part, if not solely, influenced by the kinds of amounts that we're talking about, like a commission. So the bigger the amounts that they are dealing with, the bigger their fee, because it's in the form of a commission. Is that right? So it doesn't depend on how many hours they put into the job and how much effort they put into the job.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I think what is also quite interesting is the timelines for when these swaps were then executed. As I said, we entered into the club loan to receive the first tranche on the 1st of December 2015. On the 3rd of December 2015, there was a memorandum from, as I said, Mr. Ramasubudi, and supported by Mr. Peter, that suggested we should engage in these swaps.
And just remind me again, Mr. Peter, what was his position at that time?
He was the Group Chief Financial Officer, acting Group Chief Financial Officer at the time.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, may I refer you to the folder number 24, in order for us to be able to follow the evidence of Mr. Mahomedy.
Thank you.
Mr. Mahomedy, may you please identify that document for us?
Chairperson, this is a memorandum from Mr. Petolo Ramasubudi to Mr. Gary Peter, the acting Group Chief Financial Officer of Transnet at the time, titled 12 billion Rand Club Loan Interest Rate Risk Explanation.
And is this the one that you are referring to in paragraph 5.6.3 of your statement?
Yes, Chair.
Yes, could you please just, highlight the important aspect flowing from that document?
Chair, I think essentially this document tries to explain why Transnet should engage in the swap transaction. However, there is a shortcoming, significant shortcoming in the transaction, because the explanation given in terms of what may happen to interest rates in clause 8 or paragraph 8, it says the latest 3-month JIBA projection or forecast from BER is reflected below to give an indication of what may happen with floating interest rates over the medium term.
Yes.
Now, very clearly, we were talking about a transaction that was for a period of 15 years. To give a view of 2.5 years does not justify making a decision of a 15-year movement in interest rates. That's the one aspect of this particular memorandum that it was concerning.
May I also refer you to under the heading motivation and interrogate the issues that are listed therein, and please comment whether in the light of what you have said to the chairperson, do they make sense at all?
So once again, in paragraph 9 under motivation, it says, as per the interest rate forecast above, the short-term interest rates are expected to increase over the medium period. I'm not sure what that meant, because we're talking about short-term interest rates and then say medium period, and this poses a serious risk. However, the reality is that what is proposed on the table talks about a movement from 6.5% to 6.8%. It's a 0.3% movement. It doesn't reflect what is in the motivation that would create a business case for us to consider a long-term contract of 15 years to be swapped to a fixed rate. Chair, what is also quite significant is that there were a string of emails on the 2nd of December 2015, when one would assume that there was a contemplation of whether we should move to a fixed or floating rate.
Are you referring to those from page 461?
461 and 462.
Yes.
But I would start with 462, Chair. This is a memorandum that was attached to this document that was sent by Mr. Danny Smith, who was the Deputy Treasurer at the time, to Mr. Gary Peter and Mr. Petolo Ramasubudi. On the 2nd of December at 10:39 a.m., he writes, "My humble opinion on the interest rate exposure of the club loan." Mr. Smith had submitted a detailed memorandum
Yes.
to Mr. Peter and Mr. Ramasubudi, suggesting that the interest rate swap was not a good idea for Transnet.
In reaction to the memo that we have just dealt with.
No, Chair. The memo that we dealt with.
Mr. Ramasubudi.
Ramasubudi.
Chair, the memo.
Sorry.
Sorry, my apologies, Chair. The memo that we dealt with was dated the 3rd of December,
Yes.
so it's after this.
Okay.
Prior
Okay.
to this memo being written, Mr. Danny Smith was clear in his memorandum to say that he does not believe the swaps are a good idea for Transnet.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Peter then responds, as per page 462, "It is well written and I understand the logic." Petolo, are you in
I'm
agreement?
sorry. At 462, I have the memo from the person referred to as Danny, and I think you said it's Mr. Danny Smith.
Yes, Chair.
And then on top of that, or just above that, I have got what appears to be an email addressed to, the name doesn't appear fully, but it looks like something Danny.
Yes,
It says it is well written, and I understand the logic, but that appears to be from Gary. Isn't that Gary Peter?
Yes, Chair.
That's Gary Peter.
Yes, Chair. He
Okay.
actually acknowledges the document.
But where is the one to which they are responding, to which he is responding?
Chair, this is the mail trail, so it's a response to that
yes.
mail.
Yes.
The memorandum is actually with me. I'm not sure if it
It's
was
not
included.
in the bundle.
No,
No,
the
I don't
previous memo, Chair, it's not. The
Oh,
previous
is it?
memo alluded to by Mr. Mahomedy, it's not in the bundle.
Yeah, you see that.
Yes, but the
that's why
memorandum-
because I'm trying to get a sequence, because we saw Mr. Ramasubudi's memo
Memorandum.
where he was arguing for an interest rate swap, and then you referred to a memo, and then you read to us emails that seem to respond to that memo. So I'm looking for that memo first.
Yes.
So you say it's not here in the bundle?
No, Chair.
Oh, but it can be found.
Yes, Chair.
It should be.
We will provide that, Chair.
Okay, all right, because then it helps to connect.
Yes.
Because I think from what you are telling me, it looks like the author of that memo took a view that's contrary to the view expressed by Mr. Ramasubudi. Am I right?
Yes, you are
In
correct,
terms
Chair.
of interest rate swaps. So Mr. Ramasubudi comes with a view that's different from that one in circumstances where somebody has already said that's not the way to go. So one would therefore like to see the reasoning of both, and one assumes that Mr. Ramasubudi, one would want to know whether Mr. Ramasubudi was aware of that other memo and how one compares their reasoning as to who had a sounder reasoning for the position they were taking. Okay.
Chair, I think we will provide that memo.
Okay.
But I think it's key that on the 2nd of December, Mr. Danny Smith was clear in his view that there was not a need, or there wasn't a case for Transnet to enter into a swap.
And that is per the email on page 462.
462.
Yes, and then take us.
And you said Mr. Dan Smith was what position again?
He was the deputy treasurer of Transnet at the time, reporting to Mr. Ramasubudi.
Oh, okay, that's important.
Yes.
That's important. So, but his email, is it prior to Mr. Ramasabudi's one, in terms of dates?
No, Chair. It's
It's
actually,
after.
his email is first,
Yeah,
on the 2nd of December.
yeah.
And just to give you the full email trail, Chair, the email is from Mr. Smith to Mr. Petolo, Ramasubudi, and Mr. Peter,
Yes,
to say that he has a difference of opinion. He doesn't believe Transnet should do this.
yeah.
Mr. Ramasubudi then responds, but also, by the way, on the 2nd of December, Mr. Ramasubudi sends this exact mail and document to Mr. Eric Woods at Regiments.
Okay, okay. Well, part of what I would be looking for is where some of the people in Transnet were disagreeing with Mr. Ramasubudi. Part of what I would be looking for is their reasons, because his email where he expresses his view, on the face of it, appears to be motivated. He gives reasons. Now, one would therefore want to compare reasons for a different position and then see. Thank you.
Yes, Chair. Yes, Mr. Mahomedy, take us through that email trail.
So as we said on the 2nd of December,
Yeah.
this mail from Mr. Smith says that the annual interest rate cost between the floating rate and what is called the mid-market rate would cost Transnet in the region of approximately 200 million rand a year in additional interest. And in his view, he did not agree that Transnet should actually, in specific, he says it is recommended that the club loan not be switched to a fixed rate exposure by means of an interest rate swap, and he goes on to explain that. However, a day later, Mr. Ramasubudi then prepares the memorandum that we just talked of, where he says that he believes this should be executed by regiments. The purpose of the memorandum, if I may just add some, he says the purpose of this memorandum is to obtain approval from the acting group chief executive, the acting group chief financial officer to 1.1, hedge the interest rate exposures from a floating to fixed basis for an amount of 12 billion rand.
Chair, that is to be found on page 457.
457.
Yes.
1.2, he says, instruct Regiments Capital as per the 1064 Locomotive mandate to execute the hedges with Transnet approved counterparts. 3, the execution cost hedges by Regiments Capital will be all-inclusive in the rate of the interest rate swap. So, Chair, there's a few key issues that we have to point out. The first is, at the time, 1.2 was not valid. Regiments did not have a mandate. Their mandate had essentially been concluded a few months before that, when the 166 million was paid. That particular memorandum had concluded that mandate. So Regiments had no mandate, as far as Transnet is aware.
And any procurement process that appointed regiments?
There was no procurement process, and Mr. Peter was not authorized in terms of the delegation of authority to appoint regiments. That had to have been done through a proper procurement process, even at the time, if it were to be done through a confinement, but it would have had to have been approved by the Group Chief Executive, not the Group Chief Financial Officer.
Did it serve?
Aren't we still dealing with the matter where regiments came onto the scene by way of a session, or purported session? Or that was in regard to?
Chair, that was in regard to the 1064 advisory.
Yes,
But
yeah.
we have to also follow the timeline.
Yes, yes.
Because the last approved memorandum by the BADC, which was the authority at the time, rightly or wrongly, but it was the authority, concluded the 1064 transaction advisory when they said that the total payment will be 265.5 million. I think there was a memo in July 2015. This memo is dated the 3rd of December 2015. There was no prior approval. There was no prior approval that regiments could continue because there was no agreement essentially, that agreement had terminated in July in terms of procurement process. So they effectively just kept an agreement open.
Yeah, but was there somebody who made a decision purporting to mandate them to continue and did so without following proper procurement procedures, or was the position that they kept being around and people thought they were still mandated to continue? Or is that something that's difficult to tell?
Chair, I think it's a mix of both, to be honest with you. The first is obviously Mr. Woods was was somebody that was quite present at the Transnet offices, so that could have created that perception. But also the memorandum that's in front of us gives a sense that regiments were appointed, but there was no procurement event. What is also quite fascinating about this memo is that when we go to the recommendation of the document on page 460, it doesn't mention anything about regiments being instructed to have a mandate.
Yes.
So it starts off in the purpose of the document but trails away into the conclusion of the document, and it doesn't mention that.
But to be more specific, I mean, having reviewed all these documents pertaining to this transaction, did you come across any document that could have actually gave regiments any mandate as per this memorandum?
Chair, as I mentioned earlier on, the timing is quite critical, because the last memorandum that approved regiments to execute on any transaction relating to 1064 was significantly earlier. I think it was July 2015. There wasn't any subsequent process that appointed regiments as a mandated advisor to Transnet for this particular transaction.
And this particular transaction, did it serve on any of the committees that you elaborated upon when you adduced the evidence yesterday?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Yes. You were still at the point of highlighting those concerns which you are raising in relation to what is stated under the heading purpose. Anything else that you wish to highlight?
Maybe before you do that, you just told us that the last email or memo relating to the mandate of regiments was around July. This is now, we're dealing with a memo that comes up in December. So there's been about 5 months or so, or 6 months. So during these intervening months from July to December, would there have been other activities that regiments would have been known to be involved in with Transnet? So I'm wondering whether there had been a lull of about 5 months and suddenly there is a memo, or whether there had been a lot of activities between involving Transnet and regiments, maybe in regard to other things?
Chair, I just want to correct what I said earlier on. The last memorandum was in April 2015 relating to the transaction advisor, not July, sir.
Yes, yes, and that gives us about 8 months.
8 months.
Intervening period, yeah.
Regiments would have been involved at the time, as I best understand, in a number of other consulting arrangements. For example, there's the general freight business transaction that they were involved in, or consulting work that they were involved in. I'm not sure in terms of whether they had continued work in that 8-month period on the Treasury side or anything relating to 1064 advisory. That I'm not aware of, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I
Yes,
think
Mr. Mahomedy.
then you can
I'm saying
deal
that
with
in
the
relation
question.
to the issues that you were raising under the heading purpose, is there any other issue that you wanted to highlight to the
Yes.
Chair?
Chair, I think also one of the key issues on this memorandum, as I alluded to earlier on, in 1.3, says the execution cost of hedges by regiments capital will be all-inclusive in the rate of the interest rate swap, which means, as we understand this memorandum, that the 12 billion rand ZAR club loan, which was now going to be hedged or in an interest rate swap, whatever the interest rate swap by the financial institution would be, would include the, for want of a better word, Chair, as I said earlier on, include whatever commission was going to be paid to regiments. So we will deal with that a little later on as well. And there was no disclosure, as far as we are aware in this memorandum, of the percentage or of the rate that regiments was going to be paid.
Yes.
And this was then approved by the group.
If you go to page 460,
For
460
yes,
of the same document, and take us what it said under recommendation and comment in as far as it relates also to regiments.
so in the recommendation on page 460 under item 24, it is recommended that the acting GCFO, being the Group Chief Financial Officer, approves the hedging of the interest rate, the risk exposures on a float for fixed basis for all the 12 billion club loan drawdowns. And this is essentially compiled by the Group Treasurer at the time and signed off by Mr. Peter, who was the acting Group Chief Financial Officer at that time. Again, as I pointed out earlier on, it is not in line with the purpose of the document. The purpose of the document was to get approval on 3 matters, which was the hedging of the rate, instructing regiment's capital, and the fact that the rate would include the regiment's capital commission.
Yes.
And when we go to the recommendation, it just talks about approving the hedging of the interest rate. So it's an anomaly in how we actually prepare documents, but that is just an observation in terms of this particular document, Chair.
Under purpose, that paragraph 1.2, namely one of the purposes of the memorandum was to obtain approval from acting Group Chief Financial Officer to instruct regiment's capital as per the 1064 Locomotive's mandate to execute the hedges with Transnet approved counterparts. Now, you made the point yesterday, and I think you repeated it this morning, that, and I'm now paraphrasing, to the extent that regiments may have had any mandate to do anything, which, as I understand the position, would depend on the validity of the session from McKinsey. To the extent that they had any mandate from Transnet, the mandate they had was the mandate that McKinsey had, and that mandate was very limited. It did not include execution. That's what I understood you to have said. To the extent that that may be right, would it be correct to say paragraph 1.2 under purpose of that memo from Mr. Ramasubudi would seek to give them the mandate to get involved in the execution? Am I correct in understanding it that way?
Yes, Chair, you're correct in understanding that way. This mandate of executing is fundamentally different.
Is new.
It's new.
Yes, yes.
Chair, what is also...
And that's where your point about failure to follow procurement prescripts and procedures arises.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay.
Yes. Now, may I refer you to page 19 and take us through from paragraph 5.6.4. That's where we interrupted you.
That's now back to his statement.
Back to his statement, Chair, yes.
Yeah.
Now that we've interrogated the relevant annexures.
Chair, once again, Chair, the timeline becomes quite crucial in the conversation. As I said, on the 1st of December 2015, Transnet has a drawdown with the...
I'm sorry, we might have left some loose end in relation to that memorandum, but I may have missed this. We should finalize that by saying that Mr. Ramasubudi did get the approval that he was asking for. Is that right?
Yes, Chair.
Looking at the end of the memorandum.
Chair, I would say yes and no, because
yes.
The Chief Financial Officer was not in a position to approve points 1.2 and 1.3 essentially, but he did approve the hedging to continue.
Yes. Okay, so he got part of what he wanted.
He got part of what he wanted.
Yeah, okay, thank you. All right.
And largely what he got was the approval to actually go into the swap agreement.
Yes. And did he get paragraph 1.2 of his memo, that is the approval to instruct regiments to execute? He didn't get that.
Chair, as far as we are concerned, the delegation of authority did not allow for the Group Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Peter, to give that approval because it was something that the subcommittee of the board could only do.
No, that's a different issue. You are answering the question whether Mr. Peter had the power to grant the approval. My question is at a factual level. If rightly or wrongly, Mr. Ramasubudi thought that Mr. Peter was the right person to get approval from. And my question is whether he got approval from Mr. Peter. As a matter of fact, whether or not Mr. Peter had authority to give that approval is another issue.
Chair, in terms of this memorandum, he got that approval.
Okay, thank you. But you make the point that Mr. Peter, as far as you are concerned, did not have the authority to grant such approval.
Correct, Chair.
Okay.
Yes. You were taking us through the timeline. You said it's important.
Chair, I think it's necessary, as I said, that the drawdown occurs on the 1st of December 2015, and then there's the memorandum from Mr. Danny Smith on the 2nd of December, and then the memorandum from Mr. Ramasubudi that we've just discussed on the 3rd of December.
Yes.
To be clear, this was quite a significant transaction, and one gets the sense that it seemed to have been rushed through because the transaction, or the first part of the transaction, was executed on the 4th of December. All of this happens in a 3-day period, which is interesting as an observation, considering the magnitude of the values that we are referencing, Chair. So, on the 4th of December, Regiments then execute, as per 5.6.5 in my statement, they execute an interest rate swap on behalf of Transnet with Nedbank. This is a 4.5 billion rand drawdown. The execution of the interest rate swaps are at a fixed interest rate of 11.83%. Chair, if it may please the Commission that we look at page 455. I think it's under annexure MSM 23.
Yes.
Chair, this schedule endeavors to give the Commission a perspective on the timelines, but also some detail that gives you a perspective on the loans that were swapped and the differentials in the interest rate. At the time when the transaction was entered into, there were, for the ZAR Club loan, the rates, the interest rates at the time were around 9.03, between 9.03% and 9.12%. These were then fixed at 11.83%. And the 2.7% on average, or 2.6% on average movement is quite significant when you take into consideration the value of 4.5 billion rand. We also, there was a second swap with Nedbank on the 1st of March 2016. The second drawdown of 7.5 billion rand was made, and this drawdown was also swapped from floating to fixed on the 7th of March in a 6-day period with Nedbank as the counterparty, and that execution rate on a fixed basis was 12.27%. And when we look at those transactions, the original floating rate at the time was between 9.53% and 9.72%, but they were fixed at 12.27%. Chair, I referenced the Commission to MSM 25.
It's on page 464, Chair.
464. Thank you.
Chair, it has been brought to my attention.
I'm sorry. At a convenient time, Mr. Mkwena, you can just watch where the convenient time would be. I want to go back to Mr. Ramusibudi's memorandum and ask you a question, but I wanted to finish what you are dealing with first. 464, you said?
Yes.
Thank you.
Chair, in the review of these documentation and the review of the transactions, it was brought to my attention that the Nedbank Compliance Department required confirmation from Transnet that it was satisfied with the pricing and value of the transaction. If it pleases the Commission, I would request to read out the email on page 464.
Yes, do that.
Chairperson,
Firstly, identify it as to who are the role players that email. It was dispatched to who, by who, and the date, and take us through the contents then.
Chair, it is dispatched from a Moss Brickman of Nedbank on Wednesday, the 16th of March 2016 at 1:30 p.m. to Mr. Petolo Ramasubudi at Transnet under the subject finalization of documentation surrounding the swap transaction. I will read the entire document. It's not that long.
Yes, that's fine.
It says, "Hi Petolo. Once again, thank you for the opportunity provide to Nedbank." I'm reading it verbatim, Chair,
Yeah, that's fine.
with any possible grammatical issues.
Yeah, must be provided, but you can
Yes.
read it as it is.
Once again, thank you for the opportunity provide to Nedbank to participate in your hedging requirements. As per our discussion, in order that we are able to close the loop on the transaction completed, it would be most appreciated if you could share with us the special authority granted you to go ahead with the hedging. We are
I
still
think
awaiting.
it's if you would share with us.
If you would share with us the special authority granted you to go ahead with the hedging.
Yes.
We are still awaiting the signed confirmations, but are aware that some people are traveling. Additionally, our compliance is requesting a letter that essentially states that Transnet has looked at the transaction and the rates concluded, and that Transnet is satisfied with the pricing and value of the transaction. For ease, essentially they are looking for something along these lines. In inverted commas, in terms of the interest rate swap transactions entered into with Nedbank on or about 8th March 2016, I am aware that these trades priced at a pure mid-market rate of approximately 11.42% NACQ. I am further aware and agree that these trades were executed at a level of 12.37% NACQ, which results in a difference of 95 BPS, meaning basis points, above or over mid-market value. The trade numbers of the trades in question are set out below, and they are given. And then your assistance in this matter is much appreciated. Regards, Moss Brickman, Head Balance Sheet Management, Treasury, Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. Chair, the reason this mail is for our review is because Mr. Ramusubudi subsequently copies and pastes that particular paragraph. And this message is sent at 1:30 p.m. and he then responds, I think through his office at 5:24 p.m. to say, please find attached approval for the transaction. A few pertinent points out of this is...
I'm sorry, let's hear first where his response
Yes.
is.
Take us through his
Chair,
email.
the next page is 465.
Yes.
We'll see a note from Carol Piri, who was the then assistant to Mr. Ramusubudi on the 16th of March 2016 at 5:24 p.m. says, "Good day, Moss. For ease of reference, Mr. Ramusubudi has rephrased the content of his mail in the form of a letter for the supporting documents." And that letter is then sent through to...
It's sent to the person from Nedbank who had sent the
Yes,
email
sir.
that you read.
Yes, sir.
So this is sent on the same day, a few hours later,
Yes.
from Mr. Ramasubudi's office by a person called Carol. Yes,
Yes.
okay. Yes, you may continue.
Chair, what is interesting from our observations on this particular email is that the request for the authority that is made in this email on the 16th of March is post the transaction's been executed in December 2015 and on the, I think it was the 7th of March 2016.
Well, shouldn't you first take us to what he's attaching? Because I think your comments are on the content thereof or the date thereof, isn't it? Because the person from Nedbank, Mr. Brickman, was asking basically for proof that there was the right authority, isn't it?
Yes, Chair.
And the letter from the person referred to as Carol purports to attach the required authority. And you have some comments to say about that, but I think we must just identify where that is first.
Chair, as I see, it's not in the document that is submitted, but I think from my perspective, Chair, the point that we're making is that this request came in post the execution of the transactions. The transactions were executed, the first one in December 2015 on the 4th, and the second one was on the 7th of March 2016. This request from Nedbank is required on the 16th of March 2016.
Oh, so you are saying, or maybe they may have been a reason that made them think, you know what, we should have asked for this before. But to the extent that that authority may have existed as at that time, let's ask for it now. But we're hoping that what they would be given would show that it was authority that existed before execution. And if that happened, if that was the case, then from their point of view, they might feel that they are fine. But if the authority seems to have come after, they may or may not have been happy with that, depending on a number of things. But you are saying that from your point of view, that's the issue, that's the point you wanted to make, that the authority comes after.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, okay.
But let's go back to page 464. And let's entertain for a while what is being placed in inverted commas by Nedbank when requesting that authority in those terms. What was Nedbank actually conveying to Mr. Ramusubudi? What was it really being sought, Mr. Mahomedy, so that the chair should understand the essence of your evidence in this regard?
In essence, Chair, I think there's two things being requested in this email. The first is that Mr. Ramusubudi to provide the authority, the special authority that he would have had. That's in the uppermost paragraphs. The
That
second,
is for the swap that
to
he
execute the
wanted
swap,
to execute the swap.
which was
yeah.
already executed. Chair.
Yes.
The second piece is an authority from Transnet to say that the pricing was acceptable. Now, the reason why this is important is because there's a fact that says that in this document that says the mid-market, the pure mid-market rate was 11.42%. And the rate that was billed to Transnet was going to be 95 basis points higher. In a transaction of this nature, it is our view and our opinion that the 95 basis points was outside market conditions. It was too high. And essentially what is happening here is that there's a requirement or a request from Nedbank, or the gentleman from Nedbank, who is asking Transnet to say, after the fact, I keep saying that, Chair, because it's quite critical, after the fact to say that it's acceptable that we charged you 12.37% when the market, mid-market was 11.42%. This also has to be thought of in conjunction of my previous testimony on the swap approval memo, which said that Regiments rate will be all-inclusive, which means that in somewhere in between this rate, we believe Regiments commission was added into the rate as well, which would give one a view in terms of why the rate was 95 basis points higher.
See, when I read the email from Mr. Moss Brickman to Mr. Ramusubudi, it seems to me that it's an email that comes from a client of Transnet, or that comes from somebody who finds something strange in what is being done. and just wants to make sure that whoever says this must be done from Transnet, one, has authority to say so, two, knows or appreciates the implications for Transnet if what he is requesting to be done is done. In other words, it seems to me to be somebody who says, I don't want Transnet or anybody later on to say, I was party to doing this and that maybe I failed in my obligations, in that I didn't make sure that Transnet appreciated what the implications of doing this would be. Therefore, wanted to make sure that if anybody accused Nedbank or him of not having done his job properly, they would say, here is proof. They said they know all this, they are aware of all of this, we can go ahead, and then we went ahead. Is that a justified impression of the email from your
Yes.
point of view as a financial person?
Yes, Chair. I think this is a document that was requested to ensure exactly what you just put out. Because that was as per the mail, it says our compliance, and one would understand that to be the compliance department. So the question is who actually found, or what was it that they were looking for? What did they find that was not necessarily in line with what was in the swap agreements?
Okay, thank you.
Chair, it's also worthy to mention at this point, we will come back to the calculations of all of the values, etc., but it's also necessary to mention we have dealt with what we call the Nedbank swaps, which was the ZA Club loan, which was in a floating rate initially that was converted to these two tranches of fixed. There were also other transactions that were then converted from floating to fixed.
Before we go to other transactions, I think it is convenient for us to go back to Ramasiboti's email. Now, you remember that I asked you whether Mr. Ramasiboti got the approvals that he was asking for by way of that email, and you said partly yes, partly no, and I think you said what he got related to hedging. I just want us to go back. Is it 457? 457. Okay, thank you. You see, he was asking that memorandum was addressed to Mr. Peter. And in paragraph 1, under the heading purpose, he sets out 3 issues in respect of which he was saying he was seeking approval. Okay? And again, the one is the hedging of the interest rate risk exposure from a float for fixed basis for the amount of 12 billion rand to instruct Regiments Capital as per the 1064 Locomotive's mandate to execute the hedges with Transnet approved counterparts. 3, the execution cost of hedges by Regiments Capital will be all-inclusive in the rate of the interest rate swap. Now, when you go to the end of or to the last page at page 460, it says compiled by, and then you've got his name and his signature, and then below that it says approved, / not approved, and then below there is a signature for Mr. Gary Peter and his name. And the part that is crossed out seems to be the not approved part, which suggests that he was approving. He was being given an opportunity to say he's not approving or saying he approves, and he seems to have said, I approve. Now, that seems to me to suggest that he is approving everything for which approval was being sought from him. And if that interpretation of the memo is correct, that means he approved all the 3 items that Mr. Ramasubudi set out under the heading purpose. It may be that the reason why you answered my question the way you did is because under recommendation in paragraph 24, maybe that might not have been wide enough in your view to cover all the 3 purposes. I'm not sure. Is that the reason why you answered the way you answered?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
I think that's the key reason, because when we at Transnet prepare a memo, the requirement is that whatever you want must be very explicitly stated under the recommendation.
Yes, but you accept.
I accept
that there may be a different interpretation, that approval for all 3 items was granted.
I actually agree that technically whatever was requested in the memo was approved.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Now, Mr. Mahomedy, before you proceed with the other relevant facts in your under that heading, may I refer you to page 465? Chair, that is under folder number 25. 25, just to complete the evidence of Mr. Mahomedy pertaining to the sequence of emails that passed tense between the parties. And I think that on page 465, you might have omitted an important email. If you look right at the bottom of that page, you may wish to indicate to the chair as to who wrote that email and to whom was he writing to, and what did he say. And you can tie it up with what you wanted to convey to the chair.
Thank you, Advocate. I think
we are on 464, is that correct?
465.
465.
465.
At the bottom, that is the
Thank
last
you.
email appearing there.
Okay.
Chairperson, this email is from Mr. Ramasubudi, Petolo Ramasubudi of Transnet, to Mr. Moss Brickman, because the email addresses are exactly the same. Moss B at Netbank. This one is Netbank Capital. On the 16th of March 2016 at 3:14 p.m. The conversation is, hi Moss. In terms of the interest rate swap transactions entered into with Netbank on or about 8 March 2016, I am aware that these trades priced at pure mid-market rate of approximately 11.42% NACQ. I am further aware that and agree that these trades were executed at a level of 12.37% NACQ, which results in a difference of 95 basis points over mid-market value. This is Mr. Ramasubudi then confirming to Mr. Brickman. It is a copy and paste, Chair, of the exact paragraph on page 64 in which Mr. Brickman wrote to Mr. Ramasubudi requesting, where he says for ease, essentially they are looking for something along these lines. So exactly what is in inverted commas is copied and pasted by Mr. Ramasubudi to Mr. Brickman an hour and a half or an hour 44 minutes later.
Would that have been?
It may be that copy and paste is correct, but effectively what he does, that is Mr. Ramasubudi, is to give Mr. Moss Brickman, exactly the wording that he knows Mr. Brickman will be happy with. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah. No change of anything.
No
Is that
change.
right? Yeah. Okay.
Would that swap have been in the interest of Transnet?
Chair, I think the additional cost that, before I answer that question, Chair, I would like to just explain that there was another swap as well, another interest rate swap.
Okay, before you deal with another swap, just to make sure that we don't lose track of some of the things, we are still going to look at whatever document Mr. Ramaswamy may have provided purporting to be authority. Is that right?
Yes.
We've got such a document.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, all right. Okay, you may proceed.
Chair, as I explained earlier on, this was a total of 12 billion in loans. It was essentially the ZAR Club loan that we had entered into on a floating rate of rates between 9.03% and 9.72% at various times. This entire transaction was swapped with Nedbank. Chair, there's a further 11.3 billion rand, which was entered into as a separate.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want to make sure I follow. You say this entire transaction was swapped with Nedbank. We have been using swap so far in the context of an interest swap.
Yes.
Is that what you are talking about?
Yes, Chair.
Oh, okay. It's just that you said the entire transaction was swapped, and I wasn't sure if it still meant the same thing as swapping an interest rate.
It's still interest rates.
Yeah,
My
okay.
apologies. My
Okay.
apologies, Chair. You are 100%.
Yeah, okay.
Chairperson, the 12 billion rand in loans, the interest rate swap was with Nedbank. There were certain other transactions, as I provided an analysis earlier this morning again, which involved EDC, the Exim of Canada with Investec, Libfin, Omsfin, and Standard Bank, where we had entered into these loan transactions between 2014 and 2015. These had existed. These were transactions that were already in progress. These were then involved in an interest rate swap with the Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund, which is called for short the TSDBF. Also, by the way, Chair, executed with Regiments as the intermediary. Those rates were converted between, the original floating rates were between 8.8% and 9.9%, and they were converted at between 11.15% and 12.07%. And those were done in March 2016 and April 2016. Chair, the key issue with the pension fund swaps, or the interest rate swaps that were done with the pension fund, was that at the time, just prior to that, the pension fund, in terms of Transnet policy, did not qualify as what we call an approved counterparty, in terms of whether we could actually be doing this kind of transaction with them. There was a subsequent memo again that was signed by 2 or 3 people that said that it would be approved. It would become an approved counterparty. Saying that, Chair, I think one of the key things is that the calculation at the time of the commission, again I use the word commission loosely, and that was then paid out, calculated and paid out by the pension fund. That was for loans totaling 11.3 billion. So the interest rate swaps for Transnet affected 2 different loan types totaling 23.3 billion rand. Chair, the reason that becomes very key is when you have to do the calculations of the incremental interest,
Yes.
it is quite significant. But just before we go into the calculations of the interest, as it relates to mandates, Chair, it is also quite important to note that Transnet, being a player of significant nature in the financial services sector in terms of loans and facilities that we generate and commercial paper that we put into the market, we ordinarily do send out to the local and global banking sector what we call the mandate for trades. And this is done annually. So in 2014 and 2015, as per my annexure MSM 26, on pages 472 to 476, Chair, these are examples of mandate letters that would have gone through to various financial institutions which confirm who are the employees that are mandated to act for Transnet in certain specific transactions.
Let's pick the one on page 472 and just read for us what does it say in order for us to understand what you are testifying on.
It's a mandate for domestic market traders. The employees of Transnet SOC Limited indicated below are hereby authorized in the normal course of their employment to enter into capital and money market transactions, and more specifically to participate and deal in bonds listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, repurchase agreements, money market instruments, and interest rate derivatives on behalf of Transnet SOC Limited within the limits set out in the Delegation of Authority framework and/or the Financial Risk Management framework as approved by the Transnet Executive Committee or Board of Directors. It produces, or it goes on to name the people, provides their identity number and the signature of the relevant individual. And then it says, thus done and signed at Johannesburg in accordance with the Transnet Delegation of Authority framework. It's signed by the Group Treasurer at the time, and then countersigned by the Group Chief Financial Officer at that time. In 2014 and in 2015, it was signed by the then CFOs, or the then CFO, both of them by Mr. Anot Singh. The 2015 document on 473 is signed by Mr. Ramusubudi on the 12th of May 2015.
I see, I'm trying to see the date of the document itself at 472, and I don't see any date other than the date on which Mr. Anot Singh signed it. I had expected that where it says thus done, that would give a date. So are you, when you say it's a 2014 document, it's simply because Mr. Anot Singh's signature indicates that he signed it on the date given there, which is in 2014?
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Mahomedy, I don't understand that if there are those mandates that are sent to local financial institutions and international institutions, how would one find regiments trading on behalf of Transnet in those major transactions that we have actually canvassed?
Chair, that can only be the case if specific delegation or mandate was provided to regiments to execute a particular transaction. Later on in my testimony, I talk about the concerns as it relates to Transnet practice and Transnet processes and Transnet frameworks as it relates to all of the swap transactions. I think safe to say that our financial risk management frameworks and delegations, etc., do not allow for third parties to be executing on Transnet's behalf unless there was a specific delegation given or a specific mandate that was given to regiments.
Yes.
But if Transnet had a practice of sending out these mandates, that would mean that anybody within the relevant market, anybody of significance, would be aware that there would be specific people that Transnet would have mandated to do certain things, and therefore they would, before engaging with anybody, one would expect them to double check whether that person is somebody who is mandated by Transnet to do that. Obviously, if that person's name doesn't appear in a mandate such as this, but he or she is able to produce a special mandate or authorization, then that authorization is seen as legitimate by the third party, then they could continue. But the question one would expect the third parties to want to check whether they are dealing with somebody whose name appears in a document such as this.
Chair, that is accurate, and I think more so in the case of the significance of this value and this transaction. So I think I agree with you, Chair.
Thank you.
May I take you back to page 20 of your statement and simply to clarify one or two issues arising from there. You have testified about a number of interest swaps and others you are referencing in those relevant paragraphs, paragraph 5.6.5 and 5.6.6, and you've also mentioned the others. Financially, what does it mean to Transnet when these swaps are executed from time to time? Have you ever computed as to how much did Transnet lose?
Chair, yes, we have done the computation. I would like to just explain the computation,
Yes.
if I'm allowed to. The first thing is that when you do an interest rate swap, you are essentially looking at the future of interest rates as compared to where you are, as I explained earlier on. Which means that if the agreement was signed at, I'm using an arbitrary number of 9.5% floating at a point in time, and we then engage at 12%, as long as that rate stays at 9.5%, you will have a 2.5% deficit, and you will be always paying 2.5% more. But one has to obviously always match this because the curves, the interest rates do change. Your fixed will be exactly that, it's fixed, and as the forward view gets taken on an interest rate and you have interest rate increases in the market, etc., the differential will be lower. If the interest rate goes lower than the 9.5 that you originally went at, then it will be greater. So yes, in terms of 5, 6, 11 in my statement, we endeavor to explain.
It's on page 21, Chair.
Page 21.
Yes.
The decision to swap from floating interest rates to fixed interest rate has resulted in the following additional interest rate cost to Transnet, and this was as of the 25th of February 2019. And Chair, the context to that is that this is the differential between the interest rate over the last 3 odd years, when this was signed in 2015 December, to today, to the 25th of February 2019, just over 3 years. For the NetBank transactions, Transnet has paid additional interest of 785.3 million rand. For the pension fund transactions, Transnet has paid an additional interest, or paid additional interest of 696.6 million rand.
And this is on swaps, nothing more but swaps.
This is
Swaps.
just on the swaps. This is what we call realized losses, meaning we have paid physically realized these particular losses. We also do a calculation of what we call the unrealized loss, meaning what we estimate will be the loss of interest to the end of the transaction.
Does this represent a loss that Transnet says it would not, or it probably would not have incurred had the swap not happened?
Yes, Chair. If the swap was not executed, then we would not have had this particular cost, additional cost.
Yes. Have you, I assume that in order to answer that, you would, in order to be able to answer that question, you would have worked out exactly what Transnet would have paid if there had been no swap in interest rate. And because you have done that homework, you are able to say this loss would have been avoided.
Yes, Chair. This is that homework that has been done to
Yes.
actually look at
Yes.
what did transpire on the floating rate.
Yes.
And again, Chair, I think it's a crystal ball that not everybody owns, but it is taking a view on the long-term interest rates.
Yeah. Yeah.
The contrary position to this is one would say, well, you know, it was fixing the rate, it was all of these good things, that the advantages being that, as you pointed out earlier on, it gives you, takes away the variability, etc. That is in its place.
Yeah.
However, the key question is, should Transnet have gone into the swaps at all? And as I mentioned, the Deputy Treasurer at the time didn't agree with the swaps. The consequence of entering into the swap agreement is, as I pointed out, in terms of the realized losses of 785 million with the net bank transaction and 696.6 million with the Transnet second defined pension fund transaction.
That's altogether about 1 billion what?
It's just over 1.4 billion rand, Chair. Just about, sorry, my apologies, just about 1.4 billion rand.
About 1.4 billion rand.
And that's the differential in the interest rate between what was floating, what we would have paid,
Yeah.
versus what we are currently paying.
Yes.
And that's only to the 25th of February 2019.
Yes.
These
And as we go
contracts-
on, you will be incurring more losses.
These contracts terminate in 2030, Chair.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
I see that, Chair, you
Yeah.
are now venturing into mathematical computation,
Yes.
despite what happened between us when Mr. Volming testified.
Yes.
It's
Let's
quite
take the
possible.
let's take the short adjournment, and we'll resume at 11:30.
Yes.
We adjourn. Did I come back too early? Well, I did
Chair,
say
only
that.
if I was rising and there's a witness.
Well, I did say that we would try and improve and resume on time.
They're still trying to locate the witness, Mr. Chair. They're trying to locate the witness.
Yes. I hope my watch is not too early, is not ahead. On my watch now, it's 29 and a half minutes. Is that your watch as well?
It's too early, Chair. 29 and a half minutes. It's supposed to be
29 and a half minutes to 12. Mr. Mahomedy, my watch might be ahead of your watch. It says 29 minutes to 12 now. But I did say in the morning that I was responsible earlier for about a 5 minutes delay in our starting, and also yesterday a few minutes. So, but I did say we'll try and improve.
My apologies, Chair.
Yes.
I was.
Yes, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Mr. Mahomedy, just before the tier adjournment, you were still dealing with paragraph 5.6.11. If you can summarize what you are conveying to the Chair, please.
Chair, as I said, that the figures that we provided, the 785 million and the 696 million, is what we deem as realized losses, meaning that based on the information up to the 25th of February, that gap between the floating rate and the fixed rate has not closed. It has not narrowed for us to gain benefit from this transaction.
Yes.
In addition, we
Yes.
also do a calculation of what we would call the unrealized portion of the loss looking forward to the end of the contracts. And the calculations that we have performed to date say that there would be an additional, based on the forward curves of the interest rate as well. So it's not based on today's rate, it's based on the future perspective as well. That we have an unrealized loss of approximately a further 1.8 billion rand on these two transactions, which essentially means that if things stay as they are and the forward curves stay as they are, then Transnet will be what we would call out of the money by an estimated 3.2 billion rand over the 15 years.
Of course, what is most important to consider when one looks at such a big amount of financial loss to Transnet that arose from the decision to swap from a floating interest rate to a fixed interest rate is to what extent that decision could be said to have been a result of negligence, maybe gross negligence, or incompetence, or a criminal agenda. In other words, it's important as one looks at all of this to be able to say, to the extent that making the decision to swap from a floating interest to a fixed interest, which has now produced this loss, huge loss for Transnet. Was this simply because somebody may have meant well but just got things terribly wrong? Or is this a situation where one can say, looking at the information that was available to the person and looking at that person's experience and qualifications and competence in this kind of area, that decision could simply not have been made by somebody who meant well was trying to look after the interests of Transnet as they should. So, and it may well be that sitting there, you yourself might not be able to go as far as a certain point, but you can only go up to a certain point. But it's important that I know how far you can go in terms of saying, when I criticize this decision, I criticize it because I think the person who made it was somebody who had another agenda. Or you say, I can't go that far, but I think it was just grossly wrong or grossly negligent for anybody with that kind of experience, with those kind of qualifications, and in that position to make this decision, maybe in the light of what other people were saying on the same issue.
Chair, I think one has to look at it very circumspectly, and we have reviewed a number of documents in this regard and the overall management of the Treasury function. It is worthy to note in this particular transaction that there were no Transnet Treasury officials involved in the execution, in the calculations, in the assessment of the swaps, which in itself tells a story of, in my humble opinion, somebody not willing to take a risk that people will actually do the calculations and say no. That's the first point. The second point, Chair, in reviewing the documentation, one does not get the sense that we actually considered a 15-year position on what may or may not have happened to the interest rates for us to make an informed decision. As per the memo that we discussed, Chair, it is clear. It says, we have reviewed the short-term interest rate on the medium period. But this was a 15-year transaction, which would have required at best for us to take a longer view than 2.5 years. The memorandum from Mr. Smith is also very clear. It says that he does not, as the Deputy Treasurer, with somebody who had at the time, I think, more than 30 years experience, or about 30 years experience, it would not be opportune for somebody to ignore that. For the executives that were in place, you would have had to have considered this. Chair, one other key piece of information is that Transnet had not executed an interest rate swap for many years, which then begs the question, why this one? Why suddenly? And one has to draw the inference that it was done to benefit an entity in the like of Regiments specifically, with the significant amount of money that then flowed to Regiments around this time. And that is as far as I would go in terms of my assessment, based on the reviews that we have undertaken. The issues of negligence or gross dereliction of duty, etc., would be one for, I guess, another day. But presented with information of this nature at the time, and I guess one would also say, well, some of it is in hindsight. That is the case, but for a business the size of Transnet, one is always expected to take decisions in the interest of the business. The entity is a significant player in the South African space, but also not just in itself, but also in the space of public funding. So it would be something that you would have expected for the executives to have obtained multiple opinions on this, not to have executed based on, right now it's based on one individual that writes memorandums to say that this is what I think should happen. The magnitude of the transactions of 23 billion rand should have been considered a lot more diligently by the executives at the time, in my view, Chair.
Well, you say something that is quite significant. You say negligence and gross negligence might be for another day, but what you do say is, in your view, when you look at the facts and when you look at how this came about, the surrounding circumstances, you infer that the person who made this decision made it for the benefit of regiments. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
To assist or benefit regiments. In other words, that would mean that that person did not seek to protect Transnet's interests at that stage. That person's, what you're saying would suggest that that person sought to benefit regiments even to the detriment of Transnet. So I just want to make sure that I understand you, what you are saying, whether I understand you correctly.
Chair, that's correct from my perspective.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Now, if we can move on for you to summarize for us the contents of paragraph 5.6.12 to 5.6.14 of your statement.
Chair, I think it's necessary to say that, for what we would call an unwind of this transaction, for us to actually get to a position where these losses...
I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Mahomedy and Mr. Mokwena. I just want to go back to the question I asked you just a minute ago. You didn't want to express any opinion on the issue of negligence or gross negligence, and that's why you said maybe that's for another day. I just want to mention this to you, and then you can comment on it. If a person who was making the decision that there should be an interest rate swap was doing so in order to advantage or ensure benefits to regiments, as opposed to looking after the interests of Transnet, that would exclude negligence, because that person would have an intention, would be intending to benefit regiments as opposed to Transnet. So in other words, it's a much more serious conclusion to make against them, against that person, than to say maybe it was negligence or competence. That you understand, you have no problem with that. Okay.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Yes, okay, thank you.
But just to also, to add to this, I think it's also important, the one point that's important, or two of them, Chair, is that the short period of time between the time we execute the loan and execute the swap, one has to question, why did we not think about entering into a fixed interest loan upfront, as required by the dictates of our financial risk management framework
Yes.
within Transnet.
Yes.
It's not a decision that you should be making in between a
Yes.
transaction
Yes.
or intermittently.
Yes.
It should also form part of your strategy.
Yes, from the beginning.
From the beginning, you should have a
Yes.
funding strategy that says X amount will be floating, X amount will be fixed, and you will adhere to that. Now, had we gone into that transaction up front with a perspective of entering into a fixed rate for that period of time, we would have a very different discussion today. The rates may have been different. I don't say it would have been different. It could have been different.
Yes, yeah.
But it questions the entire process in terms of why this was made. And as I also presented, Chair, it was all done. The decision to change from fixed to floating was done in a 24, 48-hour period.
This was in, this was March 2016, is that right? When the
Chair, the
swap,
first tranche was in December 2015,
December, yeah.
on the 4th of December 2015.
yes. And the earlier, the time when it would have been, the whole thing would have been considered as a long-term view was how many months earlier than that?
Chair, we had a number of discussions that go back to September, October 2015, when
Yes.
the loans were being conceptualized at the time.
Yes, so the point you are making, the latest point you are making is this, that when you were considering the whole issue, part of what you would have considered is whether the interest rate regime that should be applicable is a fixed rate interest rate regime or a floating interest rate regime. And in considering that, you would have looked, among other things, at the long-term nature of the transaction, 15 years. And you would have looked also at the amounts involved. And then you would have taken a deliberate decision to go one way or another. And in this case, you took the decision to go the route of a floating interest rate. So the point you're making is that two, three months thereafter, a decision is taken early December by one person, maybe two persons, one asking for an approval, another one granting the approval, to change that. And you make the point to say, but if 3 months or so earlier, looking at a long-term view, a decision was taken to say the floating interest rate route is the correct one, it should have been quite difficult to change it within such a short time. That's what you're saying. There should
Yes.
have been something very special.
Yes, Chair, I think your last point, everything that you said is 100% correct, but your last point needs a little more exploration.
Yes.
The
yes.
question is what changed?
What changed
For
and what was so
Transnet-
special to change that earlier decision?
Correct.
And when you look at that memo from Mr. Ramasibudi, addressed to Mr. Peter asking for the approvals, you say you don't find anything special in the contents of that memo that would justify the change.
Chair, right up to the 1st of December, we are still in the process with the funding institutions to provide us the money. They provided on the 1st of December, and we changed this strategy on the 4th of December, literally within, or 2nd or 3rd of December, within a few days. So as you very succinctly point out, Chair, 4 or 5 months before that, why was the strategy not reconsidered? Why was the strategy to go into floating? What occurred? Or what information was available to whom
Yeah,
that
that had
would
not been
actually-
available before.
Correct. But that's a very important question you asked, Chair.
And the persons or people from Transnet who had been involved in the earlier decision to say, let's go the floating interest rate route, would that have been a number of different people who came to that decision?
Chair, that transaction was the club loan. They would have, I assume there would have been individuals that may
Yeah.
have been involved in that.
Yes. But the change was made by
An individual.
an
or two
individual with the
individuals.
approval of another individual.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
But coupled with that, Mr. Mahomedy, there was a comprehensive advice by the Deputy Treasurer
Yes.
who said that you cannot go on this interest swap in that manner. And that advice was never taken.
That advice was not taken, no. Agree. But I think, Chair, as we go further, we will give more color to what processes within Transnet should have been applied, that in our view were not applied as a result of bringing in an intermediary like Regiments.
You were at the verge where you were now summarizing for us the contents of paragraph 5.6.12 to 5.6.14.
Chair, as we said, there's different cash flows over these particular transactions. However, if the interest rates were to move in the wrong direction, and one assumes that Transnet can recover from this position, it would have to be very significant, because we first have to recover the 1.4 billion that we are out of the money already, and you would have had to look at that benefit accruing a lot sooner. And we don't, in terms of the current trends and the current forward projections, that is not where we think this transaction will conclude in any profit to Transnet. I must also hasten to point out that, as I said, the beneficiary of the TSDBF transaction is the Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund. We have also learnt that, as I said earlier on, that the Netbank swap, interest rate swap, was then effectively, if I can use the word, forward sold to the pension fund as well. For these transactions, we understand the 20 basis point fee was included in the rates as a fee. We say it's payable by Netbank. I think it's been confirmed by Netbank that they have not paid the fee directly. However, we are looking at the calculation that has been provided by Regiments. As I also said earlier on, Chair, from the documents that we reviewed, Regiments were paid 227 million rand by the pension fund. Now, it's a matter of debate as to whether they were paid the amount or whether they had extracted the amount.
Yes.
And that's something that is under debate in the courts.
Is that about whether they held themselves to the amount or whether they were paid by the pension fund? Is that what you talk about?
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
Now, in relation to those swap transactions, you identified certain irregularities and registered some of the concerns. Can you take us through those concerns that you're raising?
Chair, I think as I mentioned earlier on, Transnet had not entered into any major interest rate swaps in the recent past. And the decision to enter into a loan agreement, or the decision to enter into a loan agreement with a floating or fixed rate, should have taken place at inception of that loan, ideally. Whilst there may be circumstances, and these are normal market conditions, the outlook on the interest rate does not change on a daily basis or a weekly basis. It sometimes, unless you have quite a significant event that will create a swing in the market conditions. We did not see that in the 3 days or in the 3 months before that. I reiterate and re-emphasize the point that the Transnet Treasury team had and still has the expertise to handle these transactions, what we term vanilla transactions. These are stock standard transactions or stock standard swaps that the Transnet dealing room would have the expertise to assess and execute. I further go on page 22 under 56152 to explain what the normal process should have been within Transnet if these swaps were executed by the Transnet Treasury team. In all probability, they would have looked at the transaction and then decided how many parties should have participated in the transaction up front. That would depend on what is called the counterparty appetite. The dealing room will then obtain pricing from counterparties and do a match and understand and assess which entity provided the right price. Now, how is the right price determined? The pricing obtained under 5615.5 on page 22, Chair, pricing obtained is always benchmarked internally by the dealing team, and they utilize independent pricing models of entities like Reuters and Bloomberg. Post the event, Chair, none of these processes were followed internally at Transnet. The dealing room was not involved. They essentially were given the transaction after the conclusion to say you will record this particular transaction. When they were given this particular...
And you have not come across any document in your review of these transactions which reflects any explanation by the people concerned as to why these processes that would normally have been expected to be followed were not followed?
Chair, we haven't come across any of that. In fact, to the contrary, we've discussed this with Transnet Treasury officials and the dealing room individuals. They raised this as a concern. They were told things like, we will work around you, we will work above you, we will work through you. Those were the kinds of statements that were made when people raised objections to some of these type of transactions, to say, why is it that we are not being considered for providing our expertise? So, to the contrary, it was actually, in my humble opinion, an intent to have regiments execute these transactions.
Well, if that is true, that seems to say, don't bother us, you don't matter.
Chair,
is that a fair interpretation of what you understand was told to them?
Chair, towards the latter part of yesterday, I mentioned that the chairman of the board had made a statement at one of the board meetings suggesting that regiments had gained access to our dealing room. And when I addressed that to the officials in the dealing room, they said regiments never gained access to the dealing room. The dealing room just moved to regiments. So they executed the transactions on Transnet's behalf, and the dealing room, the individuals were not engaged or consulted in any shape or form.
And Mr. Ramasebudi and Mr. Peter would have been part of what is considered to be the dealing room?
No, Chair.
In terms of normal processes at Transnet?
No, Chair.
They would not be part of that?
No, they would not be part of that process. There's a very focused team that works on these kind of transactions. That's the dealing room.
Yes.
And they would report to Mr. Ramasubudi as the departmental supervisor or superior, and Mr. Ramasubudi would be the direct report of Mr. Peter at the time. And Mr. Peter would not as the CFO, not necessarily have a direct line with the Treasury team.
But if the people in the dealing room reported to Mr. Ramasubudi, then that means Mr. Ramasubudi was in charge of the dealing room, or was in charge of the people in the dealing room.
Yes, Chair, he was in charge of the
Yeah.
people, yes.
So he might not ordinarily have been expected to be part of a certain team, maybe, but he was in charge of them. And
That's true.
therefore, if he was in charge of them, I take it he was in charge of the dealing room.
Yes. No, I agree with you on that, Chair.
Yes.
But yes, so it would have reported to him.
I was trying to understand the concept of saying the dealing room went to regiments. So because if you say Mr. Ramasubudi was not part of the dealing room, then I'm wondering how did the dealing room go to regiments? But if Mr. Ramasubudi was in charge of the people in the dealing room, then maybe I understand what they meant.
Okay. No, you're right.
The question might be which dealing room, the one at Mackenzie or the one at Transnet?
No, what he was saying was that he was told that what Mr. Mahomedy was saying was that he was told by the people in the dealing room that the dealing room had gone to regiments. And I can only, in the context of his evidence, I can only understand that to mean that somebody other than the team that normally
Yes.
forms the dealing room, but somebody else connected with the dealing room went to regiments. Okay.
Yes, Chair.
All right. So my understanding is correct.
Correct, yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Chair, I think 561516 on page 22, we say the post the event of the interest rate swap transactions in question, the dealing team then obtained external indicative pricing from other market participants, which suggested that the margin on the second tranche of the Nedbank swap transactions, which was on the 7th of March 2016, were in the region of between 32 and 54 basis points higher as compared to quotes received. At the end of the transaction, the dealing room was then given the documents to record. Some of those dealers decided to go and check on this pricing, and they found that the Nedbank pricing was between 32 and 54 basis points higher than compared to quotes received. This is probably due.
So in other words, does this mean that somebody in the dealing room of Transnet went outside to test the quote that was being approved by those above the dealing room team and established that those above them had actually received different quotes, some of which were 32 or 50 and 54 basis points lower than the ones that were being approved. In other words, one would have expected that they would have gone for a lower one, is that right? But they'd gone for higher ones.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, which must have been quite surprising, I would guess, to the dealing team.
Correct.
Okay.
Because they then said that this is probably due to the fact that both the swaps with Nedbank and the pension fund were secured in a non-competitive environment, and in addition, both of these swaps had to include the fee of 20 basis points payable to regiments.
And that payment to regiments, you would say when we hear about it, we must remember that the fees for regiments or the commission had already been provided for elsewhere earlier.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Chair, the premium, or what we call the premium of 54 basis points on this quantum of debt over 15 years represents an approximate additional cost to Transnet of 246 million rand on a net present value at the time of the trade, and a premium of 32 basis points over 15 years approximates 146 million rand of additional cost to Transnet over the period on a net present value.
And you conclude on that topic with paragraph 5.6.16. Can you please summarize it for us?
Chair, in the LOCO advisory, and my apologies to take us all the way back, but in the LOCO transaction advisory contract, which initially was a confinement, and I may have stated yesterday it was an open tender, but it was actually a confinement that went through a process, and McKinsey, or the McKinsey consortium, was selected at that point in time. The McKinsey consortium had provided a submission to Transnet, and it included Nedbank as one of the consortium partners. We also discussed then that Nedbank, and I draw inference by the various communications between Transnet and McKinsey, informing McKinsey of the conflict of interest that was identified or perceived at the time, where Nedbank requested to be excused from the consortium as a result of them considering the need to get into funding transactions later on in the transaction. What my point here is that Nedbank had essentially submitted a bid together with McKinsey, and then later on Nedbank was replaced with Regiments as the party. That perceived conflict which existed when Nedbank withdrew was no different, in my view, to the conflict that existed when Regiments began executing transactions on Transnet's behalf as it related to the 1064 funding. And I go further to explain this. In my view, in 2015, Regiments had largely become the lead consortium partner with the exit of McKinsey at the time. They now provide advice through the advisory service. They provide advisory service on the funding program. They then execute the swaps for Nedbank and the TSDBF, the interest rate swaps for Transnet, and the counterparty being Nedbank and the Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund as the counterparties. Regiments receives significant payment from the TSDBF for this transaction. Regiments also gets paid for the arranging of the China Development Bank loan, which we spoke about earlier, of 166 million. One other fact, Chair, is that Regiments, a different company name within the Regiments stable, is also the asset manager, or one of the asset managers of this Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund. So they acted as advisor to Transnet. They then act as the executor of the transaction with Nedbank and Transnet. On the other side, they are acting as the asset manager for the pension fund. And for me, Chair, in my opinion, Regiments were conflicted in their functions on many levels.
And they're being paid in all those different roles.
In their different roles, they were being paid by different entities, some of them directly and others indirectly, with the inclusion of the 20 basis points in the rate. And I think, that for us, looking at that, executives across all of the entities should have identified this as an immediate red flag. And also, Chair, I must also state that Transnet is conducting a detailed review of this transaction with the pension fund, the implications thereof, and also the entire process around which some of these were managed at the time. And subsequently, we have also, in the recent days, read about a very significant transaction that was done on the 9th of December 2015, the date on which a specific finance minister was removed and another appointed, which in some essence from the information that we currently have impacts the Transnet Second Defined Pension Fund as well. So the total flow of this, Chair, is still a matter that is under review from Transnet's perspective.
Yes. Can we now move on to deal with the 1064 locomotive deferral options, starting from paragraph 5.7 of your statement? And firstly, give us background facts pertaining to that deferral.
During the latter part of 2015, the signing of the 1064 contracts, now the consequences of this were being felt in the business, in the sense that we had paid, as I stated at that time, significant upfront deposits, with not many locomotives by this time being received. This was causing a lot of challenges in the liquidity position at Transnet. And Mr. Peter, the then Group Chief Financial Officer at the time, contacted my office and asked that we assist in understanding the consequences and implications if Transnet were to defer the delivery schedule with the current OEMs. It was a request that obviously, when we looked at it, meant that we would be going back to the 6-year delivery schedule that was originally envisaged in the business case largely. However, we were also informed at the time by the Group CFO that the Regiments team were working and reviewing what the costs may be if we extended these contracts further. In addition, the Regiments team were also considering a number of different options, giving due consideration to the fall-off in volume at the time. They were looking at whether there were opportunities to lease some of these locomotives to other parts of the continent, creating special purpose vehicles for sale of excess locomotives, etc. These were just some of the different options that apparently the Regiments team were looking at, as I was informed by the CFO. On the 26th of February 2016, one of the employees at Regiments submitted estimated calculations to my office to say that the possible maximum deferral cost for another 2 years would be a further 13 billion rand. Chair, this would have been on top of the 54 billion rand. My team and I were not aware of which contractual mandate this team at Regiments was working on. However, at the time, I commissioned the McKinsey team to review the Regiment's proposals and consider all of the different nuances of any potential deferral of the delivery program. The McKinsey team were contracted under what was then called SWOT 2. At no additional cost, it was within the contract that was established. Chair, there is a submission in the document that talks to the process that we followed and all of the different options that were considered. However, to put a shortened version on the table, we had considered all of the current, at the time, the current progress that was being made or lack of it with the original equipment manufacturers. And there were significant challenges that each one of them was facing. Some of them, to date, have not yet been resolved. We had provided to the Group Chief Financial Officer in writing that there was absolutely no need for us to engage with original equipment manufacturers to incur additional cost, giving consideration to the production challenges that a few of them were facing, and in some cases, some of the OEMs had not even commenced production in South Africa. So based on that, we had, I would say, concluded and informed the Group Chief Financial Officer that nothing should happen. The reason we put this on the table is because there was a submission from Regiments that supposed a 13 billion rand increment in the cost of the locomotives, which we are grateful was not implemented at any point.
But
That's the reason for this.
Did you question at this stage as to how Regiments was appointed?
Yes, we did. We to date have not received any response. At that time, we were not aware of which contract they were working on.
Yes. Now, can you proceed to deal with the SWOT contracts with McKinsey and Regiments?
Chair, as I made an effort yesterday to explain the concept of SWOT, this was just the project that was created to assist Transnet at the time in making sure that the capital portfolio was something that was achievable and that it was within the constraints of the various functions within Transnet, whether it was an executable portfolio, considering that it was quite a significant portfolio at the time. At points, the portfolio was over 340 billion, and it was something that we needed to manage. I think the rationale for SWOT 1 essentially was also, I think also it's important to point out that SWOT 1 was envisaged in 2012. There was an open tender process. There was a whole lot of work that was done in 2012. I was not present in 2012 in this particular function. I only joined this department, as I said, around February 2013, when it was in the final stages of contracting with McKinsey. I think the key issue was that the team, there wasn't a very significant team in Transnet at that point, and there weren't very strict and formalized processes around the capital projects and capital programs of Transnet. The key objectives for McKinsey at the time for SWOT 1 were that they had to formulate a capital strategy, they had to define the capital portfolio of Transnet, as I said, look at whether there were opportunities to optimize this portfolio. It was 340 billion, but we had to look at it in terms of affordability at Transnet, cash availability, and all of the financial ratios, and also look at whether this portfolio was doable. And when I say doable, meaning could it be executed within the then strategy of Transnet called MDS, the Market Demand Strategy. We attached in the document some of the benefits at the time that were achieved, which were signed off by the then Group CFO as well as the Group Chief Executive.
May I refer to page 499? That is folder number 29, Chair.
Thank you.
Are you there, Mr. Mahomedy?
Yes.
Could you please identify that document?
Chair, it's a memorandum that's addressed from Mr. Anot Singh to the then Group Chief Financial Officer, to Mr. Brian Molefe, the then Group Chief Executive of Transnet.
Is it the one that you are referencing in
Yes,
your
Chair.
testimony?
The purpose of this submission is to notify the Group Chief Executive of the capital portfolio savings and benefits of the McKinsey-led consortium engaged in the capital optimization SWOT initiative.
And you were also involved in this transaction?
Yes, I was involved in the management of this contract, and the McKinsey and Regiments teams essentially reported into my office for the execution of SWOT 1 and the next program, which was called SWOT 2.
And SWOT, was that an acronym for anything?
No, Chair.
It was just a combination of letters.
I'll have to ask somebody who was there at the time, Chair. This was something that was defined in 2012.
Okay.
But it has, from what I've checked, Chair, it has no specific, the abbreviation is not representative of any specific action.
Yeah. Okay.
And if you may turn now to page 506. Chair, that is MSM 30. It should be the folder number 30.
Thank you.
And also for completeness, just identify the document and take us through the contents thereof in summary.
Chair, I think this relates to what we call, it's a document from myself to the McKinsey-led consortium at the time, specifying very detailed what the billing and invoice processes should entail, specifically in terms of who should be issuing the invoice, who should review the invoice, where it gets approved for payment, etc. Quite clearly stated to both the McKinsey teams as well as the Regiments teams that were in the organization at the time. This becomes more relevant as we go further down the document, Chair. There is reason for this, but it's actually just highlighting exactly what process was implemented at that time, who would be the responsible manager, what they would prepare. There would be a detailed benefits memo. We would have an understanding of how far they are in particular piece of the contract, etc. All that was relayed through this particular memo, making sure that there was an appropriate process for the approval of invoices for this particular project.
Yes. Can we then, take us through the other contracts involving McKinsey and Regiments as per your paragraph 5.9?
Chair, I think there were a number of other projects.
And the reason why are you highlighting them in a statement?
I think it's key for me to provide full transparency of my role with teams from McKinsey, Regiments, over the period of my tenure at Transnet. There were a number of projects that Regiments and McKinsey were involved in. As I put out the SWOT 1 and SWOT 2, these are two separate contracts, two separate projects. Then there was the manganese support contract, and I will touch on that just now, and the NMPP project, which was the new multi-purpose pipeline. These were significantly large capital projects that were under execution or getting close to execution, and my role as the general manager at the time of group capital integration and assurance was to look at some of these projects and whether we were ready for the execution of these projects, and on the NMPP was to address some of the challenges. At the time, the NMPP project was termed a project in distress. There were significant challenges to that project. Depends who you speak to. The costs had escalated exponentially from the originally envisaged business case at the time, which was written many years before that. There was a risk of security of supply to the inland of our country. The project was experiencing delays that were going on not for months, but they were now going on for years. And McKinsey was brought in at that time to assist, together with Regiments, to assist to try to bring this project back online. It was at that time in 2014, before the Locomotive contracts, it was about the biggest single investment Transnet was going to be involved in, which was ranging between 25 and 30 billion rand. So that's the context of that particular one. The manganese project was also at that time envisaged to cost Transnet anything in the region of between 15 and 26 billion rand. The McKinsey consortium were brought in to assist with preparation to make sure that the project was viable, it was ready for execution.
And how were they appointed, the McKinsey consortium?
As far as I'm aware, these contracts were also through confinement. Now, in my particular role in these, it would have been, in one case, to integrate the different entities that would have been involved in these particular projects, to assist McKinsey in coordinating all of the stakeholders. And the reason being that if we look at manganese, for example, it's spread across a number of operating divisions within Transnet, including Transnet Freight Rail, the Ports Authority, as well as the port terminal operator. So to assist in making sure that there was an integrated solution that was put on the table, I would have played quite a role in integrating the key stakeholders of the various divisions. We would also have been involved in looking at the governance processes and making sure, from a capital perspective, not a procurement perspective, that these projects were moving in the right direction. And ultimately, one of the key accountabilities was to always look at making sure the project could be delivered at the right value, with the value engineering. And that's largely the role that we would have played in a number of other transactions that involve McKinsey and Regiments.
We are now going to spend much more time on the next topic, where you are dealing now with the relevant issues pertaining to Trillion, from page 27, paragraph 5.10, and you trace those events from 25th February 2016. You may proceed to outline those facts for us.
Chairperson, I think it's also here relevant to give some context. As I spoke about the SWAT 2 contract, that was between Transnet, and the heads of agreement was with McKinsey, and at the time we were informed that the supply development partner was Regiments. On the 25th of February 2016, Chair, if I may reference the Commission to the index MSM 31, page 511.
It's folder 31, Chair.
Folder 31. Under the page number 511, I received an email from an employee of Regiments on the 25th of February 2016 at approximately 22:45 p.m. And I will read this mail. It says, it's from an employee at Regiments, Ms. Fahima Badat, on the 25th of February, as I said, to undisclosed recipients. I was one of those recipients. And it says, "Good evening, I trust that you are well. This email is to inform you that my email address will be changing effective 1st March 2016 to fahima.badat@tcp.co.za. As a consequence of the partnership reconfiguration, the Regiment's Advisory Business Unit will form part of a new group of companies, Trillion Capital Partners. We remain committed to exceptional client service during the transition. Please use my new email address going forward. Kind regards." Chair, on the 25th of February, sorry.
Well, it says to undisclosed recipients.
Yes, Chair.
That's what the author would have written.
No, Chair, they would have blind carboned it to a whole lot of people, so it wouldn't actually reflect
Yes.
who it's actually sent to, but it was sent to me,
Okay. So
amongst others.
yes. So the part that says undisclosed recipients would have been put by whom?
That's because there wasn't a specific individual that it was sent to, from an email perspective, Chair, from the system.
Okay.
So this is just a system.
That's what the system says when
Correct.
you don't.
When you blind carbon.
Oh, okay. So, but whatever the author would have done, he or she, where's a she? Is that right? She didn't want the recipients to be known.
Correct.
Is that right?
That's correct, Chair. So
Okay.
I'm not sure who it was written to.
Yes, but
all I'm aware of that I was one of the
received it,
people.
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Chair.
And you knew the author
Yes, Chair.
before that?
This was an individual who worked at Regiments
Yes,
and
okay.
had also worked on the SWAT 1 and SWAT 2 projects.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Chair, within 10 minutes of receiving that email, I then forwarded that email to certain key partners and principals at McKinsey, namely Mr. Prakash Parbu, Mr. David Fine, and Mr. Kanan Lakmiharan.
Before you proceed, you say that this was, the author of this email was somebody at Regiments.
Yes, Chair.
Who was involved in work relating to SWAT 2.
Yes, Chair.
What was her position? I just want to see how high she was in the regiment's hierarchy.
Chair, I wouldn't actually be able to confirm that, but she was one of the seniors that was on the project, yes.
Yeah, okay, all right, you may proceed.
But at this stage, Mr. Mahomedy, did you encounter Trillion before?
No, Chair.
This was the
We had
first
not
time.
encountered Trillion. We heard that there were, at this point, we heard there were rumblings of some discomfort within the regiment space. We didn't know about Trillion.
Yes.
And therefore, I think the first thing or the first action from my side was to send it to the heads of agreement partner, being McKinsey. And as I said, I literally just sent this mail on directly to them, to the various. Mr. Parbu was one of the key principals on SWAT 2. Dr. Fine was one of the partners, and Mr. Lakmiharan was also one of the principals at the time on the SWAT 2 contract.
Yes.
We sent it for information to them.
You were just about to tell us as to what you did after receiving this email.
Chair, subsequent to that, I forwarded the email to Mr. Gary Peter and Mr. Edward Thomas, amongst others, but these were the two key individuals, Mr. Peter being the Group Chief Financial Officer, and Mr. Edward Thomas being the Group Supply Chain Officer, the Head of Procurement, requesting their guidance, as in my view, at the time I said no procurement relationship existed with this new entity called Trillion. Again, as I stated to them, the SWAT 2 engagement at the time was signed with McKinsey and Regiments as the SD.
I'm sorry, are you reading from an email you sent to them?
No, Chair, I'm reading from my statement.
Or from your statement?
Page
Okay.
27.
Okay, thank you.
Paragraph 5.10.2.
Yes.
Chair, as I said on the 1st of March, after sending this mail requesting guidance around the procurement issue, because Trillion were not mentioned in any correspondence as far as I was aware of around the McKinsey contract, I followed up and escalated the matter because I didn't receive any response. I followed up and escalated the matter further to Mr. Peter at a team meeting where I was informed that McKinsey was in the process of replacing Regiments with Trillion. This was the feedback that was provided to me.
So, but, so McKinsey wasn't completely gone from the picture.
No, Chair. And in February 2016, they still had the SWAT 2 contract, which was continuing. They were still there.
Okay.
But then this problem with Regiments came about.
Yeah.
Then we receive a note to say that Trillion is coming into the picture. We follow this up. We get told that there's a process between McKinsey and Trillion to replace Regiments. However, I can't remember exactly, but there was a letter that was circulated to my office by the McKinsey partnership at the time, which was dated the 23rd of February 2016, which I annex as folder 32 on page 513.
Yes.
Chair, this letter is signed by two directors of McKinsey and addressed to Mr. Gary Peter. And in this document, they make clear that we have been informed, sorry Chair, I'm reading on page 514, towards the middle of this particular page. We have been informed that Regiment Capital's management advisory business is transitioning ownership to Trillion Capital Partners. They will be subject to the ownership composition, management and staff composition and capability criteria above. We are not able to commence a relationship with Trillion or any other partner or subcontractor until these criteria have been met and approved by our global risk and legal teams. What is clear is that on the 23rd of February 2016, McKinsey had already given clear indication to the then CFO, Mr. Gary Peter, that they had made no decision on engaging with Trillion.
Yes.
Yet on the 1st of March 2016, when I escalated the matter, I was told that there was discussion between McKinsey and they were in the process of replacing Regiments with Trillion. Chair, further to that, on the 10th of May 2016, under folder 33, page 517, there was a special acquisitions and disposals committee meeting which was held.
That is now a committee of the board.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah, okay.
This committee approved the cession of certain contracts from Regiments to Trillion.
Can you read for us paragraph 5.2?
It says, firstly, this is the Special Acquisitions and Disposals Committee meeting held on the 10th of May 2016, resolution number 5.2, my apologies, sorry, item number 5.2, session between Regiments and Trillion. Resolved that the committee approved. First bullet, the cession of the contract from Regiments Limited, Capital Pty Limited to Trillion Capital Partners, being satisfied that the triple BEE status is not affected, the increase in scope for the detailed capital optimization services, and the increase in contract value from 375 million to 463.3 million, and the contract extension from the 30th of September 2016 to the 31st of March 2018, subject to zero budget implications for the company.
Now, before you comment on the contents of that approval as per the resolution that you have just read, now, when this acquisition and disposal committee approved or purported to approve the session, do you know whether they were furnished with any sessionary agreement between the parties?
As far as we have reviewed all of the documents, Chair, we have not come across a formal session agreement.
And this body, was it aware that Trillion had not submitted any tender to Transnet in order for it to provide these services?
In terms of what was submitted to this body for approval was once again a memorandum that was presented to the Board Acquisition Disposals Committee, which I have under folder 34, but that was all.
Is it folder 34?
Yes, Chair.
Does it, I am going there, does it purport to tell the committee what the terms and conditions of the session were going to be?
Chair, as far as I have reviewed this document, it does not go into a detailed discussion on the terms of the session, but rather focuses on a letter I think that is what that was annexed to this document at the time. It's not annexed to this particular memo. On page 521.
Yes.
At the bottom end, it just states that on the 13th of April 2016, Mr. Eric Wood sent a letter to Transnet Annexure B indicating that he is ceding his rights received from Regiments to Trillion Capital Partners effective 1 March 2016. Transnet then initiated its vendor process, and there is no reason why Trillion cannot be a vendor to Transnet.
And that was all.
That is what is stated here.
And at that stage, Mr. Mahomedy, do we know whether any due diligence was conducted in relation to Trillion, who are now going to acquire the services that were initially performed by McKinsey?
Chair, on page 521.1, the very next page, there is an attempt to explain that, where they say that the EME affidavit provided for the level 2 triple BE certification indicated that they are 60% black owned. The shareholding of Trillion Holdings Pty Limited, 60% wholly owned by Mr. Salim Essa. Numibrite Pty Limited, 25% wholly owned by Mr. Eric Wood. Daniel Benjamin Roy, 1.8%. Jan Johannes Foray, 1.2%. Another company which is, I think, pronounced Arium, nominees 12%. A holding vehicle whose shares will be transferred to staff at a later stage. And the directors of this company were Eric Anthony Wood, Tebogo Lebello, Jeffrey Irvin Afriet at the time. And it just goes on to explain that Trillion, or the company, its shareholders, are not on the Transnet list of excluded tenderers.
Yes. So Trillion was going to take those services from Regiments by merely that letter and the memorandum that we've indicated to the chair, and nothing more. No procurement, no committee having reviewed any of the relevant documents.
That is correct. But I would like to add,
Yes.
in terms of point number 17 on this memorandum, just midway through that, it says, there is a requirement for the scope of the contract, the second sentence, Chairperson, there is a requirement for the scope of the contract to be increased to include the full ambit of the capital optimization program and to increase the value of the contract by the unspent.
I'm sorry, you have lost me. Where are you reading from?
Chair, I'm still on page 521.1.
Okay.
It's point number 17.
Okay, all right, thank you.
My apologies, Chair. There is a requirement for the scope of the contract to be increased to include the full ambit of the capital optimization program and to increase the value of the contract by the unspent portion of the previous capital optimization contract of 88.3 million. That contract is, the previous capital optimization contract is what we call SWAT 2. I'll give some context to that now, Chair. And to increase the contract date from 30th September to the 31st of March. So essentially, there were two particular sessions. The one was what was commonly called the General Freight Optimization Program, which was heads of agreement was with Regiments. As per point 17, it talks about the capital optimization contract, and they talk about the unspent portion of 88 million. This contract, heads of agreement, was with McKinsey. As far as I'm aware, there has been no indication from McKinsey, written or otherwise, in a form of an agreement or a letter that ceded this contract to Trillion. So there were two parts of this that we have to keep in mind. It was not just one session. It was essentially, in my humble opinion, two sessions. One was the general freight contract, which Regiments were the heads of agreement with, and that is a purported session that they talk about. But the second one is the capital optimization contract, which at the time was, the heads of agreement was with McKinsey. In addition, as far as my memory serves, that contract terminated in April 2016, which makes it strange that in May 2016 we see the contract that is essentially terminated.
Purported to be seeded.
Yes, it's purported to be ceded. Firstly, there is no indication from McKinsey that they ceded this contract to anybody, because the contract terminated, if my memory serves me correctly, I think it was the 8th of April 2016. A month later, there's a document that purports to cede that part of the contract to Trillion.
But there was also this increased scope of capital optimization of 88.3 million. Was that subjected to any formal tender or procurement within Transnet?
No. As far as I'm concerned, there wasn't even a request for that service, because at that time, this particular activity rested within the confines of my department. We were not even aware that there was this requirement or submission that was being made on our behalf. But as I said, there was a contract that previously existed which terminated in April 2016 that talks to this little piece that's called increased scope for capital optimization. But there was no procurement event, no.
Now, I posed this question to you at the time when we're still on page 517, dealing with what was approved in paragraph 5.2, and I wish to invite your comment on that paragraph.
Well, Chair, I think again, for me, it's the purported session. The documents that were submitted did not carry a session agreement. There would be a number of questions that one could ask around the due diligence of Trillion at that point in time. But again, also, whether it was even appropriate that we could have as management, and the management who submitted this submission made the claims that we did around the value, the session, as well as the increased scope of 83 million rand.
This session referred to in item 5.2 at page 157. That is a resolution of the acquisition or special acquisitions and disposals committee of the board. Doesn't the wording doesn't refer to an approval in principle or approval of a session in principle, which is different from approving the actual session. And to the extent that that is the correct reading of that resolution, then one would say, how could the committee approve a session without seeing the actual session where the terms and conditions would be set out? And you have said that you, through your process of reviewing all these transactions and looking at all kinds of documents, you have been unable to come across the actual agreement, the actual session.
Chair, that is correct. And to your previous point, Chair, I agree wholeheartedly, because as the executives and non-executive directors of the business, the key issue is one has to understand the terms and conditions of that session to ensure that the session was not going to put Transnet through any undue risk. That would have been expected of that committee as well as the executives who made the submission. Yes. However, there's a single letter, as far as I'm aware, that says Mr. Wood is proposing that this be ceded. The problem with that is that he's a member of Regiments at the time, and he's a member of Trillion later on as well. So, again, one could question this from many different conflict angles as well.
Because the importance of an in-principle decision is where the board or the committee might be saying, in principle, we approve negotiations for a session. But in the end, we must see the session and then see whether we, in the light of the terms and conditions, we approve.
Yes.
But you can't, it's difficult to see how you can approve an agreement without seeing the terms and conditions of the agreement.
I agree.
Yes. Okay.
But could this be the services that one could simply cede without having to really invite tenders and ensure that there's an open, fair, transparent, competitive procurement system?
No, that's clearly not apparent in the process that was followed here. It was merely a transfer of a contract from one entity to another with no procurement event. If that entity was not going to actually execute the transactions, you would have had to have gone back and asked why, because there was a contract in place for that entity to deliver, in this case, Regiments, whatever the deliverables were expected. So it doesn't, from a procurement perspective, it doesn't necessarily make sense that we would have just ceded over a contract without understanding the session agreement, without understanding the risks to Transnet, without assessing whether there was a need to actually go out on a new procurement event instead of just, so this was essentially, for want of a better phrase, Chair, would like not, this is not part of a procurement principle in Transnet, but it became a confidential, confined session. That's really what happened here, because this entity came out of nowhere.
Well, a question which I asked Mr. Volmink last week when he gave his evidence was whether a session is compatible with the whole idea of tenders, procurement. Because the idea of procurement of a tender is that one, the body issuing the tender, Transnet in this case, wants to get the best service for as reasonable a price as possible, for the cheapest price they can get out of the market. Sometimes there may be certain factors that are taken into account, but basically that's where you start from. You know, if two companies are going to give you a service that is equal, and one offers you a cheaper price than the other, you go for the one with the cheaper price. Excuse me. There may be factors where you may legitimately tamper with that, but that's the starting point. And now, but then the other factor is that you have an obligation to ensure that who you give business to is dealt with transparently to avoid corruption. And one of the factors you have to take into account is, can they deliver? Number one. Number two, you want to see a lot of things about their credibility and so on and so on. And you invite different people to tender. And if And nobody who meets the requirements is excluded. As long as you meet the requirements, you may put in your bid. So if now, having gone through that process, you are going and you have chosen a particular service provider, and then before they can finish the job, they say, well, we'll give this job to somebody else. From now on, it is so and so that will do this job. It doesn't seem that it's compatible with the whole idea of a tender. It seems that a service provider which for one or other reason realizes that they can no longer perform in accordance with the contract should come back and say, we have difficulties, we can't perform, and then you as the business must then decide how that should be dealt with, and it may well be that you should put out a tender for somebody who can finish that job. So I don't know whether you are able to say anything on this, but the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that the whole idea of a session is incompatible with the whole idea of tenders and open and transparent processes that are required by Section 217 of the Constitution and our procurement legislation.
Chair, if I may comment on that.
And I appreciate that maybe some of this might be law,
yes, and
you might not be able to express a view, but I just give you a chance to comment if you want to.
Chair, earlier in my testimony, we talk of the McKinsey Consortium on 1064 advisory, and we mentioned that because there was a change in the consortium composition, that process was deemed irregular. It would hold the same principle in my view, in terms of the consortium in this case here was Regiments and McKinsey, became Trillion, with McKinsey being excluded. And you bring, in this case, even further, you remove Regiments as the entity, the juristic entity that the contract was entered into with, and replace them with an entity that's completely different. To Advocate McKenna's point as well, I think it's important that when we talk about the due diligence, did we do a due diligence on the capacity and capability of this entity to execute exactly what was originally envisaged in the contracts? And that question remains unanswered or is absent in terms of the memorandum. And I think, Chair, to opine on what you've just put out, I think that it is not compatible to have sessions as you would bring in, you could bring in significant undue risk into a procurement event that was essentially de-risked at the time of the event. There could be a whole host of other matters that we'll have to look at, but I think this particular session is flawed fundamentally because the consortium that had put in the bid was McKinsey or at the time Regiments and McKinsey, and that was fundamentally changed, firstly by removing McKinsey and then replacing them with Trillion. So I think that I support some of your views, Chair.
Yes. May I refer you to page 28 to 8 of your statement?
Yes.
With particular reference to paragraph 5.10.5.3, where you state that, where it was stated by the ADC that there was an increase in contract value of GFB, contract from 375 million to 463.3 million. Do you know which contract are they referring to here?
Yes, there was a contract called General Freight Optimization.
Yes.
which I believe the heads of agreement was between Transnet and Regiments, with McKinsey as a partner or a supply development partner to that, to Regiments.
But they were now going to be performed by
Trillion.
Trillion.
Yes.
And when that scope of that magnitude was being envisaged, also that component did not go to any procurement or any tender processes.
As far as I'm aware, the initial contract to Regiments was also a confinement.
Yes.
So it went through a confinement process, but this increase in scope did not go through any procurement activities.
Yes. Chair, would this be an appropriate time to adjourn for lunch?
Yes, let us take the lunch adjournment and we'll resume at 2. We adjourn.
For us,